Welcome to the YoggNation, the Spirit of Gratitude podcast on the One Integration platform. Hello, friends. My name is Yogesh Patel, and this podcast explores the themes of bullying, self-awareness, and the power of our inner spirit, including the silent battles we all face. Join me every week as I invite high-profile guests as we explore how adversity shapes us, how gratitude lifts us, and how we can all uncover the inner strength that we all have within ourselves. Join the conversation. I appreciate you listening in. My next guest is USA Today and international best-selling author Tracey Enerson Wood. Her body of work has focused on cookbooks honoring military veterans and historical fiction, focusing on the incredible women whose stories have been lost in history, including President Woodrow Wilson's wife and the sister of the Wright brothers. A former registered nurse, she joins us to talk about her journey as an author, the tie-in between her cookbooks and historical fiction genres, which is I want to know as well, and true fact, the bullying that the Wright brothers had endured. With gratitude, welcome to the podcast, Tracey.
Hi, thank you, Yogesh. So great to see you again.
Likewise, absolutely. My honor, my pleasure. Well, I'm very curious to know, Tracey. First question. Again, curiosity kills a cat. What exactly is the tie-in between your cookbooks and the historical fiction genres that you write about?
Well, I would say that the tie-in is family, definitely family, which maybe seems a stretch from historical fiction, but not for me and how it all developed. I wrote Homefront Cooking because, well, I didn't write it, I compiled it actually. It's a collection of stories and recipes from American veterans and their loved ones. I compiled that because my family had many military members. My husband, my son-in-law, my father, my father-in-law, my brother. So I've always been surrounded by military people, and I know my father especially used to tell stories, not so much about the war. Or the army, but he would tell like funny little anecdotes, and usually those stories were told, around the dinner table. I think that's where most of us share our best stories, right? We're always gathering together to eat, at least my family. So I started thinking about how all these wonderful family stories of veterans that they would share around the table, and how through the generations they're being lost. I started looking for some compilations of these kind of anecdotes, and I really couldn't find it. So I came up with this idea of Homefront Cooking to capture those family stories, just quick little stories, and their recipes, and photographs that they had. And I put it all together in Homefront Cooking: Recipes, Wit, and Wisdom from American veterans and their families. And then we put it together and published it, and then we donate all proceeds to to veterans organizations. So I felt very good about that. And then to kind of continue on with a family story, I realized that I was really in love with sort of hidden stories. And I actually found this story about the building of the Brooklyn Bridge. This is, sort of my segue into historical fiction. And I love the story because it was about, John Roebling, the engineer of the bridge from Germany, where I had lived many years, had come back with this dream of building this magnificent bridge. But he unfortunately is killed very early on in the process. And then he hands it down to his son, Washington, who took over for his dad. He was also a trained civil engineer. And then he became unable to go on, and he passed it down to his wife. Now, here this kind of tied in with a lot of things I was doing as a military wife. I kind of took over the family and the household when my husband was deployed, which was a lot. So I was really attracted to this story, and I wanted to find the story and read about it. And there are, many books about the Brooklyn Bridge. David McCullough, for example, wrote a great nonfiction book about it called The Great Bridge, and there's others. But I couldn't find Emily's story. Emily was the one, she was the wife of Washington, who rescued the project when all the men were unable to do it. And even though she was not an engineer, she basically trained herself to be.
Wasn't there a condition that affected Washington?
Yes,
A medical condition or health condition?
he suffered from what they called then caisson disease, from being way down in the foundations, which are 50 to 100 feet below water. So we now think of it as the bends, right, from being under the pressure. Well, as the chief engineer, he was going up and down many, many times a day, very quickly every time. So he suffered more than most. There were several that died of the disease because they didn't know what it was or how to treat it. And he slowly became quite incapacitated till at one point in 1872, mind you, that was 11 years before the bridge was completed, he was no longer able to go to the building site, and he sent Emily in his stead.
Wow, I had no idea.
Yeah, so so I started thinking about the tying of family and history and the women behind the scenes, which I always was, and I don't know, it all just kind of came together, and then I found more and more women whose stories were untold, women that we've never heard of, but who changed history and we should have heard of, and so that's my passion now.
I love that. I mean, you're giving a voice from a historical record that perhaps maybe wasn't in any biography, but what is behind the scenes.
I guess I've done it a little bit differently, or I look at it differently than maybe a historian was. There are a few short biographies. For example, my novel, The War Nurse, is a short little biography called Finding Themselves. And, it's about yay big and it's technical. And okay, so here's a little bit. I was never a good history student. I mean, I was always a very good student, but history was my only B subject, right? Because to tell you the truth, I found it boring. And all the wars and the numbers and the generals and the arrows coming down, and I just I couldn't put myself into it. I couldn't empathize with it. It was just numbers and facts and memorization, which not my real strong point. So one time I discovered historical fiction reading actually War and Remembrance by Herman Wouk, which was back then. This
Brings me back to my sophomore year in high school.
Oh, it was amazing. And so this is back in, oh gosh, maybe late 70s ish. I'm old. And that's what historical fiction was. And it was pretty much what I call now men's historical fiction. But I still loved it because at least now there were characters and there were motivations and there was dialogue and all these things that make a novel, right? Make a novel fun. But I was learning history. It's bringing history to life, right? And I'm kind of learning things that, maybe I should have known or got because it was now interesting. So then after that, I started seeking more and more historical fiction. And and then when more women's, I call it, historical fiction started coming around by authors such as Marie Benedict, I really fell in love with the genre and was reading everything I could, but I really still wasn't finding stories about the lost women of history, the women's stories that we didn't know about. And though that's why I kind of found my niche there, finding these people like Katherine Wright Haskell, who no one ever heard of prior to my book. Now I think, hopefully more people have heard of her.
Well, curious, that leads me to my next question. What did you learn about yourself in the pursuit of researching these characters and writing these books?
Well, it's a funny thing. So, as a beginning novelist, a really important thing to do is to send your manuscript, your pages, whatever you have, out to others, right? Beta readers or groups of friends and fellow writers, and get feedback because you just don't know what's not coming across at the page, especially at first, till you got a few books under your belt. And consistently, I was getting responses like, yeah, this is all good and everything, beautiful scenery, but where's the drama? Where's the conflict? You need it. It's a novel. You need to have kind of, constant, every scene. It's got to have some kind of conflict. And what I learned about myself is I don't like conflict. In my own personal life, I pretty much avoid it. I tease one end of my family that kind of like, uh, I hate to stereotype them, but they're like of Italian heritage, right? And they're just loud, boisterous, and when they have something, they talk it all out. And they say terrible things to each other. That just horrifies me. And then, 10 minutes later, and it's all gone and la la la, that's how they work it through. Where the other side of my family, more Irish American, we would rather just hold a grudge for 10 years. We just don't say anything. We just, just eventually we'll get over it. I don't think that's the better way. But that's what I learned. I think I was avoiding conflict and drama in my own writing because I avoid it in my own life. So, but I did learn a workaround.
Well, do you think that spills over? I mean, and yeah, and I guess in terms of the person listening in the quiet corner of a room, this whole notion of avoiding conflict, do you think that's good or bad, or it just depends on the situation and circumstance? Because again, a lot of what this podcast aims to fulfill is that self-awareness, that inner spirit, and conflict is something that is just a part of everyday life.
It is. And I think actually my writing journey and realizing this avoidance of conflict, which is not always the best thing, I think I've improved myself through this knowledge and improved my writing through knowing that I'm avoiding this and finding ways that I could have drama and conflict. And it didn't have to be, loud yelling at each other or swearing, which, I really hate, or physical. So much of the drama and the conflict, as in real life, is internal, right? It's the internal conflict that I think drives a story. And that is something that we need to be very aware of in our own life, how our own internal conflict affects how we deal with others, because they don't know, they're not in our head, right? And unless we share that and understand it and know how to deal with it, I don't know that we can progress in a relationship. So I think it's a pretty important thing.
Yeah, I guess it reminds me of one of the previous guests. He was the personal priest of Priyanka Chopra and Nick Jonas, and he said that 90% of our worries, struggles, challenges are self-created in our minds due to the wrong beliefs, due to the wrong knowledge, due to the wrong expectations. And so I certainly can understand that point, Tracey, that you just brought up.
Inner awareness, very important.
Yeah, absolutely. Yep. And then, did you ever live inside the characters of these ladies and women that you wrote about?
I always do. I have to really identify with a protagonist, and that's one of the reasons I choose how I choose them, because I'm sort of living in their body. I'm seeing with their eyes and hearing with their ears and feeling. That's how I write. I write very sensory. So I'm trying to think how they would be thinking, and forget about me and put myself into I guess, like a method actor. I've never been an actor, but I think of myself as a writer, as sort of an actor taking on a part and really trying to live the part and understand their motivations that they would have, the character would have, not myself.
Yeah, and I think on that topic, Tracy, in your book, Catherine the Wright Sister, you write about the interaction between Catherine, Orville, and Wilbur, where the brothers were having a difficult time with their flying machine at the time before their historical flight to Kitty Hawk. And Catherine states one day, "Boys, I need you, excuse me, boys, what I need from you is a decision. Is this still your dream, or are you happy with the direction your lives have taken? If it is the latter, I should focus on my own happiness." I guess, what do you make of that sentence from your own journey, or perhaps the journey of other women that sacrifice their well being for others?
Yeah, I think there does come a point where you make a conscious choice. I think it's fine to live for others, live for the family, but bottom line, you have to have your own fulfillment, your own happiness too. And I think it's okay. I think in Catherine's case, she joined their journey because that in her mind was a more important journey than what she had originally set out to do, which would have been the traditional journey for a woman of the time: get married, raise children, and run a household. But frankly, she'd already done that because she'd run the household since their mother had died, and when she was still in her mid-teens. So it's like, kind of been there, done that. So, but she was perfectly willing and probably wanted to still have a bit of the traditional dream, But if it worked for everybody, she was also willing to, to sacrifice some part of herself, not all of herself. And I think that's key. Some part of herself because the greater picture for the entire family was more important than what would be her very first choice to do for herself. And I think that's, to yeah, I think it is I think it is a matter of balance. If she did chose selfishly, how is that balancing everything in her life? So there's always balance. As we mentioned already, I was a military wife and I was happy to do it. Was that what I had set out to do when I went to college to be a nurse and thought I was gonna, save the world that way, patient at a time? Um, but then falling in love kind of changes thing, and then the goal becomes more global and inclusive, and yeah, you have to make a conscious decision. Where do you really want to? Where do you really want to go? Whose goals uh, take precedence, and can you do them both at the same time? Usually not. You can't usually do them both at the same time. So there's and in marriage, it's always give and take, right? So you know. But now my husband is following me around on my book tour, so that that's a switch. And
And tell the citizens of YoggNation the book tour that you were on board. That was incredible. Queen Mary too. Amazing.
yeah, I've the grass has not grown under my feet. I had a pretty extensive book tour, and I loved it. I mean, sometimes yeah, it's not always easy. There are early wake up calls and times where you would just like to sit and have a glass of wine and chat. But no, you've got to, keep moving on. So it's, a bit stressful, especially if you're doing three events in three different states and in a day. But I also love it. Yeah, I love I love talking to people about books. I love hearing their stories, and and that interaction is really important. I kind of first learned of that when I was playwriting, and I'd see my play. I wrote usually short, funny plays, but seeing my words come out of actors' mouths up there on the stage, and then seeing and feeling the audience's reaction to it was like, did I write that? Because it's completely different when you hear it coming and see it coming out of an actor's mouth and see the reactions. It's like it's something else altogether because everybody is taking their own personal bit of it, right? How does it affect them? Those lines meant one thing to me, but they mean something else to the actors and something else to the audience. And I think that's kind of where my addiction came in. That's why I love book tours.
Yeah, that it looks like that is what fulfills your spirit of gratitude.
Yeah, I
Seeing the value that you bring to others.
helping others, maybe helping them make decisions, maybe even if it's just entertaining them for an hour or two or eight. It's my gift to them, and yeah, that keeps me. I've always I was a nurse. It's you're never not a nurse, right? And so it's just ingrained in me that what can I do for another? How can I make someone else's life better?
Well, speaking of nurse, you've given yourself to others when they've asked you for help, and you don't think twice about that. But you yourself do not ask for help. Why is that?
Yeah, I am kind of stubborn that way. I was raised in a big family, right? I have a family of eight, six kids, and we were brought up to be self-efficient. And and as my parents had six kids, the older one took care of the second one took care of the third one. I was right in the middle, so I was expected not only to take care of myself but the younger ones too. And that was just ingrained in it. So as soon as, and I think that's good parenting, really. As soon as a child is able to do something, they should be doing it on their own, right? And then we had the added responsibility of helping the younger ones too. And then when I was actually about the same age that Catherine was when she lost her mother, I basically lost my mother to mental illness. And I had to take over the family basically because the older ones had moved away at a very young age. And when you've been in charge like that at a young age, it's kind of hard to give it up. It's hard to stop and ask for help. It's hard to because it's not about me. It's yeah, you're right. That's it's something I'm not very good at. But in writing, I did learn early on that a really important lesson for new writers is you really, really do have to depend on others. It just, especially in the beginning, it cannot be a solo venture, and that was a pretty good learning experience for me.
I'm sure. Yeah, well, that stubbornness also carries through, I'm sure, in other elements of your life as well.
Oh yeah, just ask my husband.
Well, I didn't want to say it, but now that you brought it up. And then final question, and this has been amazing. This is, I want to take a little, deep dive a little more and double click on this. But in your research, what did you learn about the Wright brothers being bullied? I guess, at the time, newspapers were making fun of their idea, saying that it was idle pastimes for the rich. I would have to imagine that if the Wright brothers were not bullied, perhaps aviation may have taken a different turn in history, whether it would have come later or just perhaps in a different, perhaps flying vehicle.
Oh, I think, and obviously I've done a lot of research on aviation history, and what I've come to the conclusion is um, the airplane would have been invented, there were so many people working on it, they were close. It would have been invented eventually. However, it probably wouldn't have happened for probably many months and probably several years because all the inventors were kind of following the wrong formulas that the Wright brothers discovered through their own very hard work and experiments. They were the only ones who discovered some real true secrets that everybody else didn't know. So here,
Wait, I'm sorry, is this the shape of the wing that you're talking about or something else?
that is, yeah, that's the main thing. The ailerons, ways to control, like because they were able, they were others were learning to go up and crash down. They were not able to control. So they discovered there's three axes that they needed to control, and they discovered ways to do that through twisting the wings. But what I discovered through my research is the other people were years behind. Even the US government was years behind because of their discoveries. And those years were absolutely critical because the Wright brothers, and I have to say, Catherine, the Wright sister, did most of this, sold the airplane and the idea of the airplane to our allies, the countries that became our allies, I should say, in World War One. Right? So the allies, France, Germany, and actually Italy, had the airplane during the latter years of World War One, which it was between the Americans coming in 1917 and aviation, which the Germans were behind on, did not have it, completely turned the tide of the war. So my hypothesis is if it weren't for Catherine, who pushed the boys and financially, emotionally, scientifically, and especially her marketing abilities, if it not for her, they would not have invented the airplane. They would not have marketed the airplane to our allies, and we very well could have lost World War One.
Well, maybe even taking a step back, though, how exactly were the Wright brothers bullied?
Oh, so that the bullying incident happened fairly young in their childhood, and it completely changed the direction of the family. They were a fairly typical family, Midwestern family. They did, of course, later have a bicycle shop, but that was their goal. They were all hardworking and stuff, and they had a hobby of flying toy airplanes and that kind of thing, but not really the motivation. Till one day, um, Wilbur was preparing to go to Yale. He had a full scholarship. He was a brilliant athlete and a brilliant person. Had full scholarship. Was going to go to Yale, and that was, the start of their family moving on. But they all went ice skating at a pond in Dayton, and um, at this point, kind of have to explain a little bit about the brothers. If they were alive today, modern psychologists would probably term them as being on the spectrum or neurodivergent because they did not have social skills. They were very, very intellectual, smart, but I think you understand, if I say those two words, what they were like. It was Catherine who interacted for them. Anyway, as you can imagine, this is the way they were. You can imagine they were teased, right? Because of the way they were. So one day they went skating on a pond, and one of the kids, a high school kid who had teased him before, uh, picked up a hockey stick and whacked poor Wilbur over the head and knocked him out and basically broke his face, broke his jaw, knocked out his teeth. He was unconscious. It was a very, very nasty, terrible injury. It was so bad that it took him 2 years to heal from this. But in those 2 years, they didn't just give up and like, oh, poor me. I don't even get to go to Yale, lost my scholarship. Oh, always me. Since they all had this fascination with aviation, they started reading. Wilbur would get every book, and Catherine would haul them home a lot of times, every book known on aviation, every journal, even if they came from France. And Catherine would translate from the French. And it became something that the entire family just wrapped themselves around, that they would invent the airplane that humans have been trying to do since the days of, at least since Leonardo da Vinci, right? And they just convinced themselves that they could figure it out. But it was that incident. It was turning around that bullying incident, and that, I hate to say gave them the opportunity, but opened the door, shall we say, for going in a unique direction that they hadn't anticipated.
That's incredible, because I think this is what the nucleus of this podcast is. It's how to overcome adversity in whatever shape, form it manifests itself, whether it is bullying or fighting your own inner demons, to then be able to move through that, move beyond that, and become a successful individual. And so
I think sometimes things are thrown at you and it's not necessarily a bad thing. It's all in how you deal with it. Life is always going to have ups and downs. It's all in how you deal with it, how you learn from it, how you learn from each other, how you support each other, how you form new goals. Challenges are a good thing.
Yeah, that's no doubt. And we all face them. Everyone on this earth has a story to tell. And that to me is what brings life to this podcast, because you get so many different angles and directions and perspectives on these various topics. And every single one of us is unique, having our own stories that ultimately you learn something from someone and apply to your own self, whether that is a reminder, an inspiration, or something that you potentially can rediscover about yourself. So for me,
It's not always comfortable.
it's not, and I think I guess personally speaking, for me, it's having the courage to speak up and sharing those feelings to another person without the fear of being judged or misjudged.
It's harder than you think, isn't it?
It shouldn't be, right? Again, that's where the mind acts as its own worst enemy, because it's not bad. Yeah.
Yeah, maybe it's easier for you than for me.
Well, Tracey, this has been amazing. I will give you the final word. Is there anything that I haven't asked that you would like to share to what I call the citizens of YoggNation that are listening to this podcast?
I think it's just as Yogi said. I mean, experience the experience. Ask for help when you need it. Grow and learn and take those challenges and turn them around to improve your life and improve the lives of others. Feel your inner spirit and be aware of your inner spirit and be aware of the things that you're afraid to do, because maybe those are the very important things that you need to do. Being in touch with your inner spirit. I know you focus on that, but I think it's really, really important, because you can't reach out to others until you're comfortable with yourself.
Wow, that was a revelation for myself. That's definitely the biggest takeaway that I've learned from this.
I do have one little quote, if I could add. Do I have a minute to add? This is my favorite quote. I just read this like a few weeks ago, and it's like 2 sentences, but it's really powerful, okay? And I found this quote in the book A Tree Grows in Brooklyn, an American classic by Betty Smith. And it says, what Grandma Mary Romilly said, to look at everything always as though you were seeing it for either the first time or the last time. Thus your time on earth filled with glory. I mean, doesn't that just say everything? Appreciate every moment, learn from every moment. Don't take those around you for granted. If there's someone you love, tell them that, and treat that person you see every day like it's the first time you see them, or the last. I just think that's really powerful.
It is not only powerful, but a great way to end today's segment, for now at least. I'm sure that could have been its own podcast episode itself. Well, Tracey, again, thank you for joining us. And for the listeners, hope you took a nugget of wisdom that hopefully applies to yourself. And if it doesn't apply to yourself, it perhaps might be important for others to sink in and to digest. Again, a lot of this podcast aims to provide that nugget of wisdom, that nugget of inspiration that you can reflect and say, you know what, it's not as bad as I thought. And I guess to hear Tracey talk about these historical figures being bullied and how they overcame this adversity to, gosh, leave their footprint in mankind or humankind. It's pretty incredible. Tracey, again, thanks, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you. Thank you so much, and God bless.